Hello there. Welcome to the episode in the history of the Old and New Testaments that covers the period of time between the two testaments, called the intertestamental period. The period between the two testaments, the Old Testament, closes round about 420 BC, and the New Testament supposedly starts at the birth of Jesus, or the birth of John the Baptist actually, which was supposed for many years to have been the year zero, as it were, where the BC changed to AD, but they got the dates wrong when they sorted out the calendars, and we think the birth of Jesus was somewhere around about 5 or 4 BC. So we're talking about the period between about 420 BC and 5 BC. And we have had, up until this point, various empires dominating the international scene, as it were, with the history of the Jewish people right in the middle of it. And we had the Syrians to begin with, and the Philistines and other Moabites and all the other smaller groups. And then we had the Assyrians, and then the Babylonians, and then the Medes and Persians. And we now need to talk about the rise of the Greek Empire. All the empires so far, if you look at a map, have been to the east of Palestine or the south in terms of Egypt. But now we have off the normal map that we look at, off to the west, the Greek city-states. And we will have during this period an overlap between the Greeks having reached the zenith of their power and influence, and then the rise of Rome, and there will be an overlap. And I think what I will do is give you an overview of the history of Rome. If you don't know, you might know a few people involved in it, but some of the significant events. And the Greek Empire and the Roman Empire overlap a bit. The Greeks start first. So let's start with them. So there were something like between 150 and 330 city-states in Greece, and they joined together in a league in 478 BC, which is, of course, before the end of the Old Testament, but they don't figure in the Old Testament at all. They're right over to the west, and they're just doing their own thing. And this develops over the next 40 years into what's known as the Athenian Empire in 431 BC. And then Philip of Macedon comes to the fore. He is the father of Alexander, who became known as Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great lived from 356 to 323 BC. He died at the age of 33. Don't know what the world would have been like if he had lived longer. But Alexander the Great, he expanded the Greek Empire, which when he first took it over was simply the city-states of Greece plus a little bit extra. He expanded that empire and he conquered territory right the way across the whole of the Mediterranean, from Greece going eastward, right the way across to the borders of India. Phenomenal expansion. At such speed, his prowess and everything, absolutely phenomenal. Very powerful, very great leader, Alexander the Great. But he died at the age of 33. Some people think he died of a fever. We don't know what he died of, but he wasn't murdered or anything. He died. And he left a baby son. And there was nobody to take over this vast empire that he had built up in a very short space of time. So the whole thing was very unstable. And in order to secure stability, his empire was not left in the hands of a baby boy, but his empire was split amongst his 4 generals. And the 4 generals of his army founded dynasties of their own in the different parts of the world. And it's known as the Hellenistic period, which was from 323 to 331. No, 323 right down to 31 BC. So that's 300 years, nearly 300 years of Greek domination of the Mediterranean world, basically. And Greek culture spread very widely, including the Greek language. Over those 300 years, the Greek language became the international language of the whole Mediterranean area. And it was so widespread and so established. It is the reason why most of the New Testament documents were written in Greek, not in Latin, which was, of course, the Roman language, because everybody spoke Greek and it was used as the international business language and communication language over many different cultures at that time. It became the universally known language and everybody wrote things in that language, and that's why we have the New Testament written in Greek. Greek culture spread language, arts, philosophy, religion, sculpture, the arts. The Greeks, very, very influential. They conquered, yes, but their culture was adopted freely by many, many people because it was wonderful. Greek culture, you've only got to look at some of the artefacts in places like the British Museum to see the amazing sculpture and art that was produced by the Greek Empire. So when Alexander the Great died at the age of 33, and his empire was split in 4 ways. It was split, so Southwest Asia was the Seleucid kingdom. Northeast Africa became the Ptolemaic kingdom, that is spelt Ptolemaic, Ptolemaic kingdom. They ruled in Egypt and North Africa. And interestingly, just to make sure you understand this, that Cleopatra, who we think of as the Queen of Egypt, just before Jesus comes into the world, she was actually a Greek, a descendant of the Ptolemies, the Ptolemaic general who took over Egypt. And Southeast Asia was the Greco-Bactrian kingdom, and northwest area was Greek, and those last 2 were very soon swallowed up by the other 2 who were much more powerful and much greater in influence. Now, we have to say that while this Greek culture spread was happening, Rome was beginning. The seeds of Rome were sown, and Rome begins technically round about something like 325 BC, the founding of Rome. So we'll go back and look at Rome, or maybe we might have to. Well, so we've got the Greek kingdom, and the territory in which the Jewish people lived moved between the Ptolemaic kingdom, which was the kingdom in Egypt, and the Seleucid kingdom, which was in the Syria and Asia Minor area, and the power kept moving between one and the other, and there were times when Israel was underneath. The territory of Israel was under the power of the Egyptians, and times when it was under the power of the Seleucids in the Asian kingdom. So I think we might have to just do a little bit about Rome now. So Rome conquers the city-states of Italy in 325 BC, and by 270 BC, Rome is ruling the whole of Italy and becoming quite powerful. And then there's a 25-year war called the First Punic War. You must think that the Greeks had conquered and moved eastward, and they weren't really concerned with Italy and Rome and northwestern Africa. They were only really concerned with Egypt. And so while all of the Greek stuff was going on, the Romans had their own war going on for 25 years, the First Punic War, which was against Carthage, which was northwest Africa. And eventually they were fighting for control of Sicily, the island of Sicily. Eventually Rome won and Carthage paid tribute. And then 25 years later there was a second Punic War which lasted for 16 years when Rome invades Spain. And when Rome does that, Hannibal, the one with the elephants, Hannibal, the one with the elephants, comes across from Carthage. And while Rome is invading Spain, Hannibal comes to invade Italy. And Rome then goes across to Carthage as a counterattack, and in 201 Hannibal returns from Italy to Carthage and is defeated. There's all the business about the elephants and the mountains and everything. It's quite a story. So there's a third Punic War which lasts for 3 years, which is in 149 to 146 BC, when Rome again attacks Carthage, and Carthage is then utterly destroyed, and Rome comes to rule northwest Africa, Spain and Italy. So then in 100 BC, what a year to be born in, Julius Caesar is born in 100 BC. And by 59 BC, when Caesar presumably is something like 41, it's strange doing the backwards counting. So in 59 BC, there's the first what's called the triumvirate ruling Rome. That is Julius Caesar, Crassus and Pompey, ruling Rome as a threesome. We're predating, we haven't got emperors in Rome yet. This is still ruling by the Senate. And then in 55 BC, 4 years later, Julius Caesar invades England. In 49 BC, Caesar declares himself to be dictator of the Roman Empire, as it was the Roman rule. And Pompey, his former colleague, and Caesar fight for power. Pompey flees to Egypt and is killed when Caesar conquers Egypt. And Cleopatra then takes up the rule of Egypt for Rome, on behalf of Rome. 45 BC, Caesar is accepted as the sole ruler of Rome, instead of a Senate or joint rulership, which had been before, and he becomes emperor. And a year later, he's killed, he's murdered, and a second triumvirate, threesome ruling is set in place. That's Mark Antony, Lepidus and Octavian. And there is a tussle for power between these three great men. Lepidus dies, and Antony and Octavian fight for power. Antony, who was allied with Cleopatra in Egypt, is defeated in 31 BC, and he commits suicide. Octavian tries to take Cleopatra prisoner and control Egypt, but she kills herself. And then 27 BC, Octavian becomes emperor, and he takes the title Augustus, and he becomes Caesar Augustus. And then we're almost at the start of the New Testament, because it was while Caesar Augustus was in power that the census was made, which caused Joseph and Mary to go down to Bethlehem. So that's Rome. But in the meantime, while all that is happening in Rome, the Greeks have established kingdoms, because all the Rome bit is all Western Mediterranean, Spain and Carthage and Italy, and So we have in Palestine, in the area that the Jewish people are living in, quite a period of turmoil, really. No clear leadership, all being ruled by these different generals that have been put into place by the Greeks. Into this time comes the Septuagint. Let me just mention the Septuagint. The Septuagint, because of the rise of the use of the Greek language for writing things and for understanding things, it was the international language. A group of 70 or so Jewish scholars go to Alexandria in Egypt, which was a great city then, Alexandria, and they settle down to translate the Old Testament into Greek. And it's called the Septuagint. And it's because of the Septuagint that we sometimes find quotations in the New Testament of the Old Testament not looking quite the same as they are in our Old Testament. And that's because they're a translation of a translation, because it was translated into Greek, and many of the people in the New Testament used the Greek translation of the Hebrew to quote Old Testament from. And as we have discovered more and more ancient texts, and we translate from the oldest text we possibly can, we find that there are slight differences in the text, and that's because of this extra language in the middle of it. So we have all this Greek or Hellenization of things, let's say. The influence of the Greeks in the whole of the Mediterranean world was enormous. And the Greeks had a very different view on life, on how people should behave. And they had a great love, as we know, for athletics and for nudity, and they admired the human body. We know so many of the statues that have been found in the Parthenon and other places are naked statues, because they thought the human body was the most marvellous thing. And of course it is the most marvellous thing, but they didn't have the same view of modesty that the Jewish people had. So we come to what's called the Maccabean period, which is between 167 and 63 BC. It's called the Maccabean period because there was a family called the Maccabees who were prominent in resisting the Hellenization, the Greek, the making Greek of so many things, and they stood up for the Jewish faith and for the Jewish customs. And in the Apocrypha, which we don't have in our Protestant Bibles, but in the Apocrypha there's 1 and 2 Maccabees, 2 books which, a bit like Kings and Chronicles and Samuel, tell the story of what happened during this turbulent period. So in this Maccabean, what led up to this was there were some Jews who accepted and absorbed the Greek culture that came in, and they had built a gymnasium in Jerusalem. A gymnasium was a place where athletics and physical activities happened, just like they do now. Sports happen and competitions and everything, and all of the Greek activities like that were conducted naked. And of course, a Jewish man, it was only men, of course, it was not women, it was only men. It was obvious that they were Jews because of their circumcision. And they were mocked and laughed at by the Greeks because they had marred or damaged the human form to the Greek thinking. And so there were some Jews who stopped circumcising because they didn't want to stand out in this Greek world, and they didn't want to look different to everybody else. There was a man called Antiochus IV, nicknamed Epiphanes, and he was a ruler in the hierarchy in the descendancy of the Seleucid kingdom, which was the kingdom set up in Southwest Asia. And he became ruler in 175 BC. And he oppressed the Jewish people very harshly. He murdered the high priest. There was a whole lot of high priests who did a little bit of local ruling, and Onias III was murdered. And there was a lot of unrest and civil war. There were holy vessels stolen from the temple. There was rioting, and in order to control the Jewish people, Antiochus pillaged the temple and put in new rules which forbade the Jews they weren't allowed to observe the Sabbath, they were not allowed to circumcise their children, they were not allowed to observe Jewish festivals, and there was a lot of reaction, as you can imagine. So the conflict escalated between the pro-Greek Jews and the traditional Jews. And it got so harsh that Antiochus forbade all Jewish religious activity on pain of execution. Owning a copy of the Torah was a capital offence, and many copies of the 5 books of Moses particularly were burned publicly. If a child was circumcised, the entire family would be executed. It was very harsh, very cruel. And then he topped it all by erecting a statue to Zeus in the temple. The Maccabees, the Maccabean family, led guerrilla resistance from the mountains against all of this harshness put in by Antiochus. And they won many battles. They managed to take control of the temple and cleanse it. And when Antiochus died, his successor negotiated a compromise, and religious freedom was reintroduced for the Jews. And the Maccabees family ruled local affairs for about 100 years. It was in 63 BC when Pompey, who we mentioned in the first triumvirate, he intervened and he helped settle the unrest by making Judea a client state of Rome. Rome had grown by this point to a place of influence, and coming under the banner of Rome gave more stability than they'd had for a long time. So we've mentioned already Caesar and the dictatorship and everything, and Pompey and Caesar and Cleopatra in Egypt. We've mentioned all of that. And all we have left to mention really is Herod the Great. So things have settled down in Judea and it's become a Roman province. And the Romans, who didn't really understand Jewish affairs very, very much, they appointed Herod. He became Herod the Great. He was appointed King of the Jews by the Roman Senate in 37 BC. He instituted an enormous building program. He rebuilt the temple, he built palaces, he built the cities of Masada, Caesarea and Herodium. He imposed a huge tax burden on the people to pay for all of this. He was not a Jew. He was an Idumean. He was descended from the Edomites, and the Jewish people hated him. Now the Romans thought he was God's gift to the Jews because he was a local person, but he wasn't a Jew. He was an Idumean, and the Jews hated him. And he had at least 10 wives, one of which was an important Jewess. He tried to win favour with the Jews by marrying the right woman. He had at least 14 children. And in order to maintain his position on the throne, he killed his mother and one of his wives, the Jewish wife, and at least 3 of his sons in order to secure his throne. It's no wonder that he sent soldiers to kill the babies in Bethlehem, and no wonder that he reacted so aggressively to the idea that a Jewish king had been born in his territory when the Magi came to see him. He was obsessed with power. He was terrified of being dethroned. And it was a play on words that said it was safer to be one of Herod's pigs than to be his son, because he killed so many of his family members in order to establish himself on the throne. So we come to the beginning of the New Testament, and we have then the perfect situation for the coming of Jesus. We have a universal language provided by the Greeks. We have universal peace and movement about the known world under the Romans, the Pax Romana that they established. No need for passports, travelling from one place to another. We have a degree of stability that we haven't had for the best part of those 400 years between the Old and New Testaments. Well, that took longer to tell than I thought it would. We had 25 minutes. Do listen to this bit by bit and go back over it. I hope it's clear. It's a fascinating period of history with so many people, and I've only skimmed the surface of it. There's so much more that could be said about the different personalities. But God bless you. Next one will be the background to the New Testament. Bye-bye.